Sometimes love looks like a father carrying his daughter through the rain when her wheelchair breaks down. Sometimes sacrifice looks like doing it alone for years, with no one watching and no one helping. At sunset on a stormy evening at a highway rest stop, Lucinda Blake saw a man in his 50s carrying a young woman on his back across a flooded parking lot. The wheelchair sat abandoned in the rain. Most people drove past without a second look. Lucinda almost did too, but something stopped her. The man was Gerald Ross, a widower who'd been caring for his paralyzed daughter since his wife died. What Lucinda didn't know was that decades ago, this same man saved her brother's life. How could one rainy evening reveal a connection that would change everything? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lucinda Blake had learned to measure her life in silences, the kind that filled her 20-room estate in the hills overlooking the valley, where the only sounds were her footsteps echoing on marble floors and the distant hum of staff who knew better than to disturb her unless absolutely necessary. At 58, she had perfected the art of existing without truly living, a skill honed over 2 decades of carefully constructed isolation. The morning of that fateful evening had started like any other. She'd woken at 6, reviewed foundation reports over coffee she barely tasted, and signed off on funding allocations that would change lives she'd never meet. The Blake Foundation for Neurological Rehabilitation had been her singular purpose since Peter's death, a monument to a brother she'd failed to save, built on guilt and the kind of wealth that makes everything possible except forgiveness. Her assistant, Patricia Whitmore, had knocked precisely at 9. The quarterly board meeting is at 2, Mrs. Blake. They'll want to discuss the expansion proposal. Lucinda hadn't looked up from the architect's plans spread across her desk. Tell them I'll consider it. I need time to think. Patricia had hesitated at the door, a woman in her late 40s who'd been with Lucinda long enough to recognize the walls her employer built around herself. You know, you could visit one of the facilities yourself. See the work firsthand. The patients receive excellent care. That's what matters. Lucinda's tone had been polite but final, the same voice she used to end all conversations that threatened to become personal. Now, driving through the storm at sunset, Lucinda wondered why she'd taken the highway route instead of her usual path. The board meeting had run long, filled with numbers and projections that should have satisfied her, but left her feeling hollow. She told herself it was the weather, wanted to avoid the winding mountain roads in the rain, but some part of her knew she was lying. The rest stop appeared through the downpour like a beacon, and she pulled in only because her driver, Marcus, had suggested it. Just for a moment, ma'am. Let the worst of it pass. That's when she saw them. The man was drenched, his jacket dark with rain, carrying a young woman on his back with the kind of careful determination that spoke of long practice. The woman's arms were wrapped around his neck, her legs hanging limp, and even from a distance, Lucinda could see the exhaustion in both their faces. Behind them, maybe 20 feet back, a wheelchair sat tilted in a puddle, one wheel bent at an unnatural angle. Lucinda's hand went to the door handle before she even realized she was moving. "Mom?" Marcus's voice held surprise. In 3 years of employment, he'd never seen her approach a stranger. "Wait here," she said, and stepped into the rain. The cold hit her like a shock, soaking through her Italian wool coat in seconds. She walked toward them, her heels splashing through puddles, watching as the man noticed her approach. Up close, she could see he was probably in his early 50s, with weathered hands and the kind of face that had seen too many hard days. But his eyes, there was something in them that made her breath catch. Not defeat, despite everything, but a fierce, protective love that reminded her of something she'd lost long ago. "Excuse me," Lucinda called over the rain. "Do you need help?" The man stopped, shifting the young woman's weight carefully. "We're fine, thank you." His voice was rough, proud, the kind that said accepting help didn't come easy, but the young woman on his back spoke up, her voice tired but gentle. "Dad, please." "We're not fine. Dad." The word settled something in Lucinda's chest. She moved closer, really looking at the young woman now. Mid-20s, with her father's eyes and a dignity that her obvious disability couldn't diminish. "I'm Lucinda Blake. I run a rehabilitation foundation about 15 miles from here. Please, let me help you." Gerald, she'd learned his name was Gerald Ross, met her eyes with a mixture of suspicion and desperate hope. The wheelchair broke. "I just need to get her to the truck and we'll figure it out from there. Where's your truck?" He nodded toward the far end of the parking lot, at least 100 yards away. Lucinda made a decision that would have shocked anyone who knew her. "My car is right here. Let me drive you both. We can come back for the wheelchair. We don't need charity." The words came out harder than he probably intended, but Lucinda understood pride. She'd built walls with it. "It's not charity," she said quietly. "It's one human being helping another on a terrible night. Please." The young woman, Natalie, Lucinda would soon learn, tightened her arms around her father's neck. "Dad, I'm so tired." "Please, just this once, let someone help." Lucinda saw the moment Gerald's resistance crumbled, saw the weight of years of carrying everything alone finally become too much. He nodded, just barely, and she turned back toward her car, waving Marcus out to help. Between the three of them, they got Natalie settled in the back seat, her father beside her, his arm supporting her, even though she was safely seated. Lucinda climbed in front, aware of how her $1,000 coat was ruining the leather, not caring at all. "The truck is—" "I know," Lucinda interrupted gently. "But first, let me take you to the foundation. It's closer, it's dry, and we have medical staff on duty. They can check your daughter, make sure she's okay after being in the rain. Then we'll arrange to get your truck and the wheelchair. Please." She watched in the rearview mirror as Gerald looked at his daughter, saw the silent communication between them, the way years of caregiving had created a language beyond words. "Okay," he finally said. "Thank you." As Marcus pulled back onto the highway, Lucinda found herself studying the pair in the mirror. Gerald had pulled off his soaked jacket and draped it over Natalie's shoulders, his own shirt clinging to him, but his focus entirely on making sure she was warm. There was something achingly familiar about his face, about the set of his jaw, and the way his hands moved with such practiced care. "How long has she been—" Lucinda started, then stopped, unsure how to phrase it delicately. 5 years, Natalie answered, saving her the awkwardness. "Started with numbness in my feet. Now it's everything from the waist down. Dad's been taking care of me since Mom died 3 years ago." "I'm sorry," Lucinda said, and meant it more than she'd meant anything in a long time. "We manage," Gerald said, his voice protective. "We do just fine," but Lucinda had spent 20 years running a foundation built on understanding what people didn't say. She heard the exhaustion beneath the pride. She saw the medical equipment debt in the worn state of his clothes, recognized the particular isolation that came from being someone's entire world. The foundation appeared through the rain, lit up like a small city, modern and welcoming in equal measure. She designed it that way, wanted it to feel like hope made concrete. As they pulled up to the entrance, she saw Gerald's eyes widen slightly at the scale of it. "All of this," he said softly. "You built all of this?" "In memory of my brother," Lucinda replied, surprising herself with the admission. "He had a second chance at life once. I wanted to give that to others." Something flickered across Gerald's face then, too quick for her to read, but it sent an odd shiver through her, like recognition, or maybe regret. The administrative staff looked up in shock as Lucinda Blake herself walked through the lobby, soaking wet, supporting a stranger. She barely noticed their stares, too focused on making sure Natalie was comfortable. That Gerald knew where everything was, that they both felt, for maybe the first time in a long while, like they'd finally stopped carrying their burdens alone. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, something new was beginning. Dr. Vanessa Pritchard had seen thousands of patients in her 30 years as a neurologist, but something about the young woman sitting before her made her pause. Maybe it was the quiet dignity in Natalie Ross's face, or the way her father hovered nearby, not intrusive, just present. like he'd been standing guard for so long he didn't know how to do anything else. "The damage is significant," Dr. Pritchard said gently, reviewing the hasty examination she'd performed. "But I've seen worse cases show remarkable improvement with the right treatment." Gerald straightened in his chair. "Well, what kind of treatment?" "We've been developing a new protocol here at the Foundation. Combination therapy, targeted nerve stimulation, specialized physical therapy, and a new medication that's showing promise in clinical trials." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "It's not a cure, but we've seen patients regain significant function." Natalie's hand tightened on her father's arm. "How significant?" "In some cases, partial mobility, walking with assistance. It depends on the individual," but Dr. Pritchard met her eyes. "There's real hope here, Natalie. More than you've probably had in a while." Gerald cleared his throat. "How much does something like this cost?" The number Dr. Pritchard quoted made the color drain from his face. Even with the Foundation's sliding scale, even with insurance, which Gerald barely had anymore, it was impossible. She saw him doing the math in his head, saw the moment hope turn to ash. "I see," he said quietly. "Well, thank you for your time, Doctor. We should be going." "Wait." Dr. Pritchard glanced toward the door, then back at them. "Mrs. Blake has been known to make exceptions, special cases. This facility exists because she believes everyone deserves a chance. Let me talk to her." "We're not a charity case," Gerald said, that old pride rising up again. "No, you're not." Dr. Pritchard's voice was firm. "You're a father who's done everything humanly possible for his daughter. There's no shame in accepting help when it's offered." Before Gerald could respond, there was a soft knock on the door. Lucinda stepped inside, still wearing the dry clothes she'd changed into, her hair falling loose around her shoulders in a way that made her look younger, more vulnerable. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said. Dr. Pritchard stood. "Actually, your timing is perfect. I was just explaining to Mr. Ross about our treatment protocol for Natalie." Lucinda's eyes moved between them, reading the tension in Gerald's shoulders, the hope and fear warring in Natalie's face. And the cost is," Gerald stopped, jaw tight, "beyond what we can manage. But we appreciate everything you've done tonight, really. We'll find another way." "What if there doesn't need to be another way?" Lucinda moved closer, her voice gentle but insistent. "The Foundation has resources specifically allocated for cases like Natalie's, young people who deserve a chance at a better life. We don't take charity." The words came out harder than Gerald intended, and he saw Lucinda flinch slightly. "It's not charity when someone needs help and someone else can provide it." Lucinda's voice remained steady. "That's just being human." Natalie spoke up then, her voice quiet but clear. "Dad, please, just listen to what she's offering." Gerald looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw what he'd been trying not to see for months. The way her body had grown thinner, more fragile, the exhaustion that never quite left her eyes, the resignation that came from years of managing pain with no end in sight. Lucinda pulled out a card from her pocket and wrote something on the back. "This is my personal number. Take the night, think it over. But please call me tomorrow. Come see the facility properly, meet the staff. Let Natalie talk to other patients in the program. Then decide." She held out the card. Gerald stared at it for a long moment before taking it, the paper feeling heavy in his hand. Weighted with possibility and pride and the terrible responsibility of making the right choice for his daughter. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly. "You don't know us. You don't owe us anything." Lucinda's expression softened, and for a moment Gerald saw past the polished exterior to something raw underneath. "Because 23 years ago, someone helped my brother when he needed it most. They didn't know him. They didn't owe him anything, but they saved his life anyway, and that gave us 13 more years together. Maybe it's time I return the favor." Something in her words made Gerald's chest tighten, a sense of déjà vu he couldn't quite place. He opened his mouth to ask more, but Natalie spoke first. "We'll come tomorrow," she said, her voice firmer than it had been in months. "Won't we, Dad?" Gerald looked at his daughter, then at Lucinda, then at the card in his hand. Every instinct told him to refuse, to walk away with his pride intact. to keep carrying this burden alone, the way he'd been doing for 3 years. But when he looked at Natalie's face, at the first real hope he'd seen there in so long, he found himself nodding. "Tomorrow," he agreed quietly. "We'll come back tomorrow." Lucinda's smile was small but genuine, transforming her face. "Good. I'll have Patricia arrange everything. A proper evaluation, meetings with the therapy team, whatever you need." Marcus appeared in the doorway. "Ma'am, I've arranged for Mr. Ross's truck to be towed to the facility. The wheelchair is in for repair, should be ready by morning." "Thank you, Marcus." Lucinda turned back to Gerald. "Let us drive you home. It's late and you've both been through enough tonight." This time Gerald didn't argue. He was too tired, too overwhelmed by everything that had happened in the span of a few hours. As they made their way back to the car, Natalie dozed against his shoulder, and he found himself studying Lucinda's profile in the dim light. There was something about her that felt familiar. Not her face exactly, but something deeper. A shared understanding of what it meant to carry guilt and responsibility, to build walls around your heart and call it protection. He wondered what had really happened to her brother. What kind of pain had driven her to build this foundation, to surround herself with helping others while keeping herself at a careful distance? The drive to their small rental house was quiet. When they pulled up, Gerald saw it through Lucinda's eyes. The peeling paint, the ramp he'd built himself, the medical supply company van parked in the driveway because he was always behind on payments. He waited for judgment, but saw only understanding in her face. "Tomorrow," she said again, as he carefully lifted Natalie from the car. 10 o'clock. I'll make sure everything's ready." "Tomorrow," he echoed. He carried Natalie inside, got her settled into bed, then stood at the window watching Lucinda's car disappear down the street. The card with her number sat on the kitchen table, and he picked it up, running his thumb over her handwriting. Something had shifted tonight. Some careful balance he'd maintained for years had tilted, and he wasn't sure if that terrified or relieved him. Maybe both. In her car, Lucinda sat in silence, staring at nothing. Patricia had mentioned finding something in the archives, an old donor list with a Gerald Ross on it from decades ago. She'd meant to ask him about it, but hadn't found the right moment. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow, she'd figure out why his face seemed so familiar, why his presence stirred something in her she'd thought long buried. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets washed clean and gleaming. Somewhere in the city, two lives that had intersected 30 years ago were circling back toward each other, drawn by forces neither quite understood. And in the space between them, the past waited, patient and inevitable, ready to reveal itself when the time was right. Tomorrow would change everything. But tonight, they both tried to convince themselves that sometimes accepting help was enough. 3 days later, Gerald stood in the lobby of the Blake Foundation, feeling like he'd stepped into a different world. The space was all glass and natural light, with photographs on the walls showing patients in various stages of recovery. People laughing, walking, living. It was hope made visible, and it made his throat tight. Natalie sat beside him in the repaired wheelchair, her hands folded in her lap. She dressed carefully that morning, wanting to look presentable, and Gerald had seen the tremor in her fingers as she tried to button her shirt. He'd helped without comment, the way he always did, preserving her dignity in the small ways that mattered. "Mr. Ross?" A woman approached, extending her hand. "I'm Patricia Whitmore, Mrs. Blake's assistant. She's expecting you." Patricia led them through corridors that smelled of coffee and hope rather than antiseptic and resignation. They passed a physical therapy room where people of all ages worked with therapists, their faces determined rather than defeated. Gerald felt something in his chest loosen slightly. Lucinda met them in what she called the consultation garden, a courtyard filled with plants and comfortable seating, designed to feel more like a home than a hospital. She dressed simply today, slacks and a soft sweater, her hair pulled back in a way that made her look approachable rather than intimidating. "Thank you for coming," she said, and Gerald heard genuine warmth in her voice. "I thought we'd start with a tour, then meet with the treatment team. If that's all right with you both. That's fine, Natalie said before Gerald could respond. We want to see everything. The tour took 2 hours. They met Dr. Pritchard again, along with physical therapist Sharon Kennedy and occupational therapist Bernard Wu. They saw the treatment rooms with their state-of-the-art equipment, the patient suites that looked more like hotel rooms than hospital accommodations, the communal spaces where patients gathered for meals and support groups. In one of the therapy rooms, Gerald watched a woman about Natalie's age take hesitant steps between parallel bars, her therapist beside her offering encouragement. The woman's face was fierce with concentration, and when she completed the length of the bars, the joy in her expression made Gerald's eyes burn. That's Isabel, Dr. Pritchard said quietly. 6 months ago she couldn't move her legs at all. Similar condition to Natalie's, Gerald saw his daughter's face transform as she watched Isabel, saw hope kindle in her eyes in a way it hadn't in years. Could I talk to her? Later, maybe. I'll arrange it, Lucinda said immediately. They ended up in Lucinda's private office, less formal than Gerald had expected. There were books on the shelves, photographs of what must have been her brother, and on her desk, a faded photograph of a mining crew from 1987. Gerald's breath caught when he saw it. But Lucinda was already speaking. The treatment program runs 16 weeks initially, she explained. Intensive therapy 6 days a week, with medical monitoring throughout. We provide housing here for out-of-town patients and their caregivers. And the cost? Gerald forced himself to ask. Lucinda met his eyes directly. The foundation will cover 70%. We have payment plans for the remainder based on income. For someone in your situation, she named a monthly figure that was still high, but not impossible. Not if he worked extra shifts, cut every corner he could find. I'd need to work, Gerald said. I can't just sit around for 16 weeks. We have a maintenance position opening, Lucinda said. And Gerald's eyes narrowed. You're creating a job for me. I'm offering employment to someone with relevant skills who happens to need it. Her voice was calm but firm. We genuinely need someone who knows their way around mechanical systems and isn't afraid of hard work. Patricia can show you the work order backlog if you don't believe me. Gerald studied her face, looking for pity or condescension, but found only straightforward honesty. I don't want special treatment. You won't get it. Bernard runs a tight ship, and he'll expect you to pull your weight. She paused. But you will get a fair wage for fair work, and you'll be close to Natalie while she's in treatment. That's not charity, Gerald. That's just practical. Natalie's hand found his. Dad, please. This is everything we've been hoping for. Gerald looked at his daughter, then at Lucinda, then at the photograph of the mining crew on her desk. Something about it nagged at him, but he couldn't place why. He took a breath, feeling the weight of 3 years of solo caregiving pressing down on his shoulders, feeling the exhaustion in his bones, feeling the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry everything alone anymore. All right, he said quietly. We'll do it. Lucinda's smile was radiant. I'll have Patricia draw up the paperwork. You can start Monday if that works for you. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of forms and meetings and introductions. Natalie met Isabel, and the 2 young women talked for an hour while Gerald pretended not to watch his daughter laugh for the first time in months. He met Bernard, the facilities manager, a gruff man in his 60s who showed Gerald the maintenance shop and outlined expectations with no-nonsense clarity. I don't care who recommended you, Bernard said bluntly. You do good work, we'll get along fine. You slack off, you're gone. Clear? Clear, Gerald said, and felt oddly reassured by the man's directness. As the sun began to set, Gerald and Natalie prepared to leave. Lucinda walked them to the entrance, and Gerald found himself hesitating at the door. Why are you really doing this? He asked quietly, while Natalie was saying goodbye to Patricia. All of it. This foundation helping us. There's more to it than just honoring your brother's memory. Lucinda was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. My brother survived something he shouldn't have. Someone saved him when they didn't have to, when it would have been easier to leave him behind. And then, 13 years later, I killed him anyway, because I was driving too fast on a wet road and I thought I was invincible. Her voice remained steady, but Gerald saw the pain underneath. I can't bring him back. I can't undo that moment, but I can make sure that when people get second chances, they don't waste them the way I wasted his. Does that make sense? Yes, Gerald said softly, understanding in his bones what it meant to carry that kind of guilt. It makes perfect sense. Their eyes met and something passed between them. Recognition of shared wounds, of lives shaped by loss and responsibility. Gerald felt the careful distance he'd maintained start to crack, felt something warm and terrifying seep through. Monday, Lucinda said, breaking the moment. 10 o'clock. We'll get Natalie settled and get you oriented. Monday, Gerald agreed. On the drive home, Natalie was quiet, but Gerald could feel her hope, could sense the shift in her that came from finally having something to work toward. He gripped the steering wheel tighter and tried not to think about how much he was trusting this woman he barely knew, how much he was risking by letting down his guard. In her office, Lucinda sat alone as darkness fell. She picked up the photograph of the mining crew, studying each face, wondering why Gerald's presence felt so familiar. Patricia's note about the archives sat on her desk, reminding her to follow up. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow she'd solve that mystery, but tonight she allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in 20 years. The fragile, tentative possibility that maybe she could help someone without it being just penance. Maybe, just maybe, this was about more than guilt. She didn't let herself examine that thought too closely. Not yet. 2 weeks into Natalie's treatment, Gerald found himself settling into a rhythm he hadn't known in years. He woke at 6, helped Natalie with her morning routine in the comfortable suite the foundation provided, then headed to the maintenance shop while she went to therapy. The work was honest and demanding, fixing equipment, managing repairs, keeping the sprawling facility running smoothly. Bernard had been true to his word, expecting excellence and giving no special treatment, which Gerald appreciated more than kindness would have allowed. But it was the small moments that surprised him. The staff who learned his name, who asked about Natalie's progress, the other patients' families who nodded in recognition, fellow travelers on the same difficult road, and Lucinda, who appeared at unexpected times in the garden where he took his lunch break, in the hallway outside Natalie's therapy sessions, always with a quiet word or a gentle question that never felt intrusive. On a Thursday afternoon, Gerald was repairing a temperamental elevator when Lucinda found him, sleeves rolled up, hands covered in grease. "I'm told you fixed the problem our regular contractor couldn't solve," she said. Leaning against the doorframe, Gerald wiped his hands on a rag. Just needed someone willing to get dirty and trace it back to the source. Wasn't complicated, just time-consuming. "Bernard says you're the best hire he's made in 5 years. She smiled. "High praise from him. He's a good man. Doesn't waste words." Gerald closed the elevator panel, testing the buttons. The car moved smoothly and he nodded with satisfaction. "How's the expansion planning going?" Patricia mentioned something about it, slowly. "The board wants 3 new facilities, but She hesitated, and Gerald saw something vulnerable cross her face. "I'm not sure I can manage that level of growth. It feels like losing control of what this place means." They walked together toward the garden, the late afternoon sun painting everything gold. Gerald had learned that Lucinda came here when she needed to think, and he'd started doing the same, drawn by the peace of it. "Tell me about him," Gerald said as they sat on a bench near the fountain. "Your brother." "If you want to." Lucinda was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. Then she began to speak, her voice soft with memory. Peter was brilliant. Not just smart, brilliant in the way that meant he saw connections other people missed. He wanted to be a neurologist, even before the accident. Wanted to help people who'd been told nothing could be done. She smiled sadly. "He worked at the mine during summers to pay for medical school. My parents had money, but Peter insisted on earning his own way. Said it would make him appreciate the opportunity more." "The accident," Gerald prompted gently, his chest tight with a feeling he couldn't name. "Shaft collapse." 1987. 5 men trapped underground for 16 hours. Her fingers twisted together in her lap. The rescue crew, they didn't have to go down there. The company said it was too dangerous, wanted to wait. But they went anyway. Pulled all 5 men out alive. Gerald's hands had gone still. 1987, shaft collapse, 5 men. The memories were there, buried under years of trying to forget. The darkness, the weight of earth pressing down, the desperate work of pulling bodies free one by one. A young man's face, terrified but alive, as Gerald had dragged him toward the light. Peter never talked much about it. Lucinda continued, unaware of Gerald's tension. But I knew it changed him. He came back different, more focused, more driven. Like he'd been given a second chance and didn't want to waste it. Her voice broke slightly. And then 13 years later I took that chance away. We were driving home from a conference. I was impatient, going too fast. The road was wet and I lost control. Peter died at the scene and I walked away without a scratch. That wasn't your fault, Gerald said, his voice rough. Accidents happen. You can't I? She turned to look at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I was driving. I made the choice to go too fast. He trusted me to get us home safely, and I failed him. Gerald recognized that guilt, had worn it himself in different forms. We all carry things we can't put down, he said quietly. But building all this, helping all these people, that's not penance. That's honoring him, is it? Lucinda's voice was almost a whisper. Or is it just another way of avoiding life? Hide behind the foundation, behind the work. Never let anyone get close enough to lose again. The honesty of it struck Gerald silent. He understood that impulse, had been living it himself for 3 years. But something about Lucinda made him want to be honest in return. My wife Sarah used to say, I had 2 modes, all in or all out. No middle ground. He studied his scarred hands. After she died, I went all out. Shut down everything except taking care of Natalie. Told myself it was noble, necessary. But really I was just... He stopped, searching for words. I was just scared of feeling too much, of failing again, of being anything except useful. And now, Lucinda asked softly, now I'm here talking to you and I'm terrified. He managed a small smile. But I'm also more alive than I've been in 3 years. So maybe being scared isn't always a bad thing. Their eyes met, and the moment stretched between them, heavy with things neither was quite ready to say. Gerald saw the way Lucinda looked at him, not with pity, but with understanding and something else, something that made his heart beat faster. I should check on Natalie, he said, standing abruptly, needing distance before he did something foolish. Her session should be finishing soon. Gerald! Lucinda stood as well, reaching out but not quite touching him. Thank you for listening, for understanding. Any time, he said, and meant it more than was probably wise. He found Natalie in the therapy room with Sharon, both of them grinning. Dad, watch this, Natalie said, and with Sharon's support she moved her toes. Just slightly, just barely, but they moved. Gerald felt his knees go weak. Natalie, it's just the beginning, Sharon said quickly. We have a long way to go. But it's real progress, Gerald. The treatment is working. That evening, after Natalie was settled and asleep, Gerald stood at the window of their suite, looking out at the foundation's grounds. Somewhere in the main building, Lucinda was probably still working, probably still carrying the weight of guilt she'd never quite learned to put down. He thought about the mining accident she'd described, about the dates and details that matched his own memories too perfectly to be coincidence. He thought about the name Peter Blake, and how it had haunted him for 30 years, not because of what happened in the mine, but because of what came after. The testimony, the accusations, the way his life had unraveled, because one scared young man had told the company what they wanted to hear. Gerald had forgiven Peter Blake years ago, understanding that they'd both been victims of a system that valued profit over people. But he'd never imagined he'd meet Peter's sister, never imagined he'd fall for her, never imagined the universe would be this cruel or this kind. He should tell her, should explain the connection, but not yet. Not when Natalie was finally making progress, not when he'd finally found a place that felt like belonging. Just a little longer, he told himself. Just until things were more stable. It was a lie, and he knew it. He was simply scared of losing this fragile new thing between them before it had a chance to grow. Scared of seeing her face when she learned the truth about who he was and what her brother had cost him. Tomorrow, he promised himself, or maybe the day after. But the truth, patient and inevitable, was already stirring in the archives where Patricia worked, already beginning its slow march toward the light. 6 weeks into treatment, Natalie achieved what Dr. Pritchard called a major milestone. She took 3 steps between the parallel bars with minimal assistance. Gerald had been in the maintenance shop when Sharon called him, and he'd run to the therapy room, arriving breathless and terrified that something had gone wrong. Instead, he found his daughter beaming, exhausted and triumphant, while the therapy staff applauded. Lucinda was there too, having apparently dropped everything when she heard the news. Their eyes met across the room, and Gerald saw his own joy, reflected back at him, along with something deeper that made his heart stutter. That evening, they celebrated with a small dinner in the Foundation's private dining room. Gerald, Natalie, Lucinda, and Isabel, who'd become Natalie's closest friend during treatment. The young women talked excitedly about their progress, making plans for what they'd do when they could walk without assistance, their voices bright with a hope that had seemed impossible 6 weeks ago. "I want to go hiking," Natalie said, her eyes distant with longing. "Just a simple trail, nothing crazy, but I want to feel the ground under my own feet, you know." "We'll go together," Isabel promised. "As soon as we're ready." Gerald watched them, his chest tight with gratitude and fear in equal measure. So much had changed so quickly. Natalie was healing. He'd found work he valued, and Lucinda had become essential to him in ways he was only beginning to understand. After the young women were settled for the night, Gerald and Lucinda found themselves in the garden again, their usual meeting place. The air was cool, carrying the scent of night-blooming flowers, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the fountain's steady splash. "She's going to make it," Lucinda said softly, taking his hand. "Natalie's going to walk again." "Thanks to you," Gerald said. "Thanks to this place, this program. I don't know how to—" His voice cracked. "I don't know how to thank you for giving me my daughter back." "You don't need to thank me." Lucinda squeezed his hand. "Seeing her progress, seeing both of you smile, that's all the thanks I need." They were quiet for a moment, comfortable in the silence that had developed between them, but Gerald could feel the weight of unspoken things pressing down, the truth he'd been avoiding for weeks now threatening to surface. "Lucinda, there's something I need to tell you," he started, but she was already speaking. "I know who you are," she said quietly. Gerald's blood went cold. "What?" Patricia found something in the archives, a newspaper article from 1987, a photograph of the mine rescue crew. She turned to face him, and her expression was unreadable. "You were there, Gerald. You were one of the men who saved Peter's life." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Gerald opened his mouth, closed it, tried to find words that wouldn't come. "I was going to tell you." "When?" There was no anger in her voice, just a quiet hurt that was somehow worse. "When were you going to tell me that you saved my brother's life, that you're the reason he got those extra 13 years? "It's more complicated than that," Gerald said, his voice rough. "Yes, I was there. Yes, I pulled Peter out of that shaft. But what came after? I know about that too." Lucinda pulled a manila folder from her bag, and Gerald's stomach dropped. Patricia found the full report, the investigation, the testimony. She opened the folder, and even in the dim light, Gerald could see the documents inside. Accident reports, investigative findings, witness statements. His own name highlighted in several places, along with words like negligence and procedural violation and disciplinary action. "Peter testified that you were responsible," Lucinda said, and her voice was steady, but Gerald could hear the tears underneath. "He said you failed to follow safety protocols, that you were the reason the shaft collapsed in the first place." "That's what he told them," Gerald said quietly. "Yes, but it's not the whole truth, is it?" Lucinda's hands were shaking as she held the folder. "I kept reading. There were other reports, other interviews. The mining company was cutting corners, pushing for faster production, ignoring safety regulations. They needed someone to blame, and you were convenient. Gerald's jaw tightened. Peter was scared. He was 24 years old, had his whole future ahead of him, and the company told him if he didn't give them a name, they'd make sure he never worked in medicine. They'd tie him up in lawsuits, ruin his career before it started. So he gave them yours. Lucinda's voice broke. He saved himself by destroying you. He was just a kid, Gerald said, surprising himself with the absence of bitterness in his voice. He made a choice under pressure. I understood that even then. The mine fired me, blacklisted me in the industry. I lost my career, my reputation, my ability to provide for my family the way I'd planned. But I was alive, and so was he, and that's what mattered. How can you be so calm about this? Lucinda's tears were falling now, catching the moonlight. He ruined your life, Gerald. Everything that came after, your wife having to work herself to exhaustion, the financial struggles, all of it, stems from what Peter did to you. And yet I'm here, Gerald said gently. I found other work. I had a daughter I love more than life itself. I met a woman who makes me feel alive for the first time in years. He reached out, wiping a tear from her cheek. If Peter hadn't testified, if things had gone differently, I might not have ended up on that highway during that rainstorm, might never have met you. And that would be the real tragedy. Lucinda shook her head, stepping back from his touch. You should hate me. You should hate this place, hate everything I represent. I built this foundation with money I inherited from Peter, money he earned, partly because you saved his life and then took the fall for what the company did. I don't hate you, Gerald said firmly. I could never hate you. You should. Her voice was anguished. Don't you see? Everything I've given you, Natalie's treatment, your job, all of it, it's built on what my brother took from you. It's not generosity, Gerald. It's blood money. It's me trying to pay back a debt I didn't even know I owed. That's not true, isn't it? Lucinda's eyes flashed. I kiss you. I let myself feel things for you, all while sitting on this secret that changes everything. What does that make me? Human, Gerald said. It makes you human. You didn't know, Lucinda. You can't be held responsible for something you had no part in. But I do know now, she said quietly, and I have to decide what to do with that knowledge. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of revelation and choice. Gerald wanted to reach for her, to close the distance that had opened in the space of a conversation, but he forced himself to stay still. What do you want to do? He asked finally. Lucinda looked at him for a long moment, her face illuminated by moonlight and tears. I don't know, she admitted. Part of me wants to give you everything, full treatment for Natalie at no cost, a permanent position here, whatever you need. Call it reparations, call it justice, call it whatever makes it feel less like I'm trying to buy forgiveness. I don't need to forgive you, Gerald said. You didn't do anything wrong, but Peter did. Her voice was barely a whisper, and I can't undo that. I can't give you back those 30 years. I can't restore what he took from you. No, Gerald agreed. You can't, but you can choose what happens next. We both can. Lucinda closed the folder, holding it against her chest like a shield. I need time to think, to process all of this. I hope you can understand. I understand, Gerald said, even though his heart was breaking. Take all the time you need. She nodded, not meeting his eyes, and walked away. Gerald watched her go, watched the woman he'd been falling in love with disappear into the building, and wondered if he'd just lost something he'd barely had time to find. In his suite, Natalie was still awake, and one look at his face told her everything. What happened? She knows, Gerald said simply. About the mine, about her brother, about everything. Natalie's expression filled with concern. And now we wait, Gerald said, sitting heavily on the couch. We wait and see if the past is stronger than the present, if what we could have together is enough to overcome what her brother took from me. Do you love her? Natalie asked quietly. Gerald looked at his daughter, this brave young woman who'd endured so much, and gave her the truth. Yes. God help me, but yes. Then fight for it, Dad. Don't let the past win. Not this time. Gerald nodded, but in his heart, he wasn't sure there was any fight left in him. He'd spent 30 years carrying the weight of that mining accident, had forgiven Peter Blake long ago. But he wasn't sure Lucinda could forgive her brother or herself, and that might be the one thing that kept them apart. 2 weeks of careful distance followed. Lucinda threw herself into foundation work, attending meetings she'd normally delegate, reviewing files she'd normally trust to staff. Gerald focused on Natalie's progress and his maintenance duties, avoiding the places where he might run into Lucinda. They moved through the same building like ghosts, aware of each other but never quite touching. Patricia watched them both with growing concern. She was the one who'd uncovered the truth, and she felt the weight of that responsibility. On a Thursday afternoon, she knocked on Lucinda's office door, carrying another manila folder. "There's more," Patricia said without preamble. "I kept digging because something didn't sit right with me. The timeline, the testimony, it was all too convenient." Lucinda looked up from her desk, exhaustion evident in every line of her face. "Patricia, I don't think I can handle any more revelations right now. You need to see this." Patricia set the folder down and opened it. This is the complete mining accident report from 1987, not the sanitized version the company released, but the full investigation that came out 5 years later when the mine finally closed. She pulled out a thick document, tabbed and highlighted. The company was under federal investigation for safety violations. They'd been cited repeatedly for inadequate shoring, outdated equipment, and pushing workers to exceed safe production quotas. The shaft that collapsed? It should have been reinforced weeks before the accident, but the company delayed to save money. Lucinda's hands trembled as she took the document. "What does this have to do with Peter's testimony?" "Everything." Patricia pulled out another document, a sworn statement dated 1992. "This is from the federal investigation. 3 former company executives testified that they coerced Peter into blaming Gerald Ross. They told him that if he didn't identify someone as responsible, they'd make sure he was charged with criminal negligence himself. They threatened his medical career, his future, everything." Lucinda read the statement, her vision blurring with tears. "They forced him." "They forced him," Patricia confirmed. "But there's more. Look at this." She pulled out a handwritten letter, the paper yellowed with age. Dated March 15th, 1992. The handwriting was Peter's. Lucinda would recognize it anywhere. "Dear Gerald Ross," Lucinda read aloud, her voice shaking. "I don't know if you'll ever read this letter. I don't even know if I'll have the courage to send it. But I need to write it anyway, need to put into words the guilt I've been carrying for 5 years. The letter went on for 3 pages, detailing everything, how the company had threatened Peter, how he'd been young and scared and convinced he had no choice, how he'd tried to recant his testimony later, but the company had buried it, how he'd spent years trying to find Gerald to apologize, to make amends somehow, but the mining company had sealed all personnel records. "You saved my life that day," the letter concluded. "You went down into that collapsed shaft when everyone else said it was too dangerous, and you pulled me out. I owed you everything, and I repaid you by destroying your career, your reputation, your future. There's no forgiveness adequate for what I've done. All I can offer is the truth. You were the bravest man I ever met, and I was the most cowardly. If you ever read this, please know that I'm sorry. More sorry than words can express. You deserved so much better than what I gave you." It was signed simply Peter Blake and dated 2 weeks before the car accident that killed him. Lucinda's tears were falling freely now, splashing onto the paper. "He never sent it." "No," Patricia said gently. "But he wrote it. He carried that guilt for 5 years, tried to make it right, and died before he could." "Where did you find this?" "In the Foundation archives. Peter's personal effects from the accident were stored here. You'd set them aside when you created the Foundation, said you'd go through them someday. This letter was in his wallet, folded up like he carried it with him." Lucinda pressed the letter to her chest, sobbing openly now. All these years, she'd thought Peter had moved on from the mine accident, had put it behind him. But he'd been carrying this guilt, this burden, just like she'd been carrying her own guilt about the accident that killed him. He was going to give this to Gerald, she said through her tears. He was carrying it with him that day. He was going to finally make it right, and then She couldn't finish the sentence. Patricia moved around the desk, pulling Lucinda into a hug. You couldn't have known. None of this is your fault, isn't it? Lucinda pulled back, wiping her eyes. I was the one driving too fast. If I'd been more careful, Peter would have lived. He would have found Gerald. He would have made amends. Everything could have been different. Or maybe everything is exactly as it's meant to be, Patricia said quietly. Maybe Peter's second chance at life wasn't just about those 13 extra years. Maybe it was about this, about you meeting Gerald, about Natalie getting treatment, about all of you finding each other. Lucinda looked at the letter again, reading her brother's words of regret and longing for forgiveness. I need to show this to Gerald. I thought you might. Patricia squeezed her shoulder. He's in the garden. Has been for the past hour. Same place you two used to meet. Lucinda grabbed the letter and the investigation documents, her hands shaking. She ran through the halls. Actually ran, startling staff who'd never seen her move with such urgency. She burst into the garden breathless and found Gerald sitting on their bench, staring at nothing. He looked up as she approached, and she saw the same exhaustion in his face that she felt in her bones. Before he could speak, she thrust the letter into his hands. Read it, she said. Please, just read it. Gerald unfolded the letter, his brow furrowed with confusion. She watched his face as he read, saw the moment comprehension dawned, saw pain and grief and something like relief wash across his features. When he finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, the letter trembling in his hands. He was sorry, Gerald said finally, his voice rough with emotion. All those years I thought he'd just moved on, never looked back. But he was sorry. He carried that letter with him, Lucinda said, sitting beside him. The day of the accident he had it in his wallet. I think he was planning to find you, to finally make it right. Gerald nodded slowly, tears streaming down his face. He never got the chance. No. Lucinda took his hand, and this time he didn't pull away. But I can. I can tell you what he wanted you to know, that you were a hero, that what happened wasn't your fault, that he spent 5 years trying to undo the damage he'd done. I forgave him, Gerald said quietly. Years ago I forgave him. I understood what pressure the company must have put on him. He was just a kid, terrified of losing everything. I never blamed him, not really. But you should have, Lucinda said fiercely. You should have been angry, should have demanded justice, should have made him pay for what he took from you. Gerald turned to look at her, and his eyes were clear despite the tears. Anger doesn't give me back those years. Resentment doesn't undo what happened. All it does is poison the present with the past. He squeezed her hand. Your brother made a mistake under impossible circumstances. He tried to make it right. He died before he could. Those are the facts, Lucinda. But they don't have to define us. How can they not? Her voice broke. Everything between us is built on what he did, what I failed to prevent. No, Gerald interrupted firmly. Everything between us is built on what we chose to do when we met. You chose to stop at that rest area. I chose to accept your help. We chose each other, Lucinda, independent of everything that came before. She looked at him through her tears. This man who'd saved her brother's life and then been destroyed for it. Who'd carried his daughter through rain and exhaustion and never stopped fighting. Who'd somehow found the capacity to forgive when he had every right to rage. I don't deserve you, she whispered. That's not your decision to make, Gerald said gently. The question isn't what either of us deserves. It's what we choose to build from here. He held up the letter. Peter wrote this because he wanted forgiveness. I'm giving it to him wherever he is. But more than that, I'm giving it to you. For carrying this guilt, for building this foundation, for helping my daughter when you had no reason to. I forgive you for things that were never your fault in the first place. Lucinda broke then, sobbing into his shoulder as he held her. All the guilt she'd carried for 20 years. All the weight of her brother's death and the secrets she hadn't known she was keeping. It all poured out in that garden while Gerald held her steady. This man who understood better than anyone what it meant to carry things you couldn't put down. When she finally pulled back, exhausted but lighter somehow, she met his eyes. "I love you," she said. "I didn't mean to, but I do." "I love you too," Gerald said. "And now we figure out what comes next." What came next, they both knew, would require courage neither had tested in years. But at least now they'd face it together. The Foundation's 20th anniversary gala was 3 weeks away, and Lucinda had a plan. She'd been working on it quietly with Patricia, keeping it secret even from Gerald. It was audacious, maybe even foolish, but it felt necessary, a public acknowledgement of the debt her family owed, and a way to finally set the record straight. In the meantime, life at the Foundation continued its forward momentum. Natalie's progress accelerated after the emotional breakthrough between Gerald and Lucinda. She was walking with a walker now, taking tentative steps that grew stronger each day. The joy in her face made everything else seem insignificant. Gerald and Lucinda had fallen into a new rhythm, more open now, without secrets weighing them down. They spent evenings together, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. The physical intimacy between them had deepened too, careful and tender, both of them treating what they had as the precious thing it was. But Gerald could sense Lucinda was planning something. She had that distracted air he'd come to recognize, the way she'd bite her lower lip when working through complex problems. He didn't push, trusting that she'd tell him when she was ready. 2 weeks before the gala, Lucinda finally revealed her plan. They were in her office, and she pulled out a presentation mock-up, her hands trembling slightly. "The Foundation's anniversary celebration," she began. "I want to use it to tell the truth. About Peter, about the mining accident, about you, everything." Gerald's stomach dropped. "Lucinda, hear me out." She opened the presentation, showing him slides she'd prepared. "I've commissioned a commemorative plaque honoring the 1987 mine rescue team. Your name will be prominent, listed as team leader, which according to the records you were. I want to present it publicly, with full acknowledgement of what happened afterward." "Why?" Gerald asked quietly. "Why make this public?" "Because you deserve it," Lucinda said fiercely. "You saved 5 lives that day, including my brother's, and instead of being honored, you were scapegoated and blacklisted. That's not just wrong, Gerald. It's an injustice that's gone uncorrected for 30 years. And you think a plaque will fix that?" "No," Lucinda met his eyes. "But it's a start. The Foundation has influence in this community. When I tell your story, when I publicly acknowledge what was done to you, it carries weight. It won't give you back those years, but it might give you back your reputation." Gerald was quiet for a long moment, processing. "What about Peter?" "You'd have to talk about his testimony, about what he did." "I'll tell the truth," Lucinda said. "That he was coerced by the mining company, that he spent years trying to make amends. I'll read his letter, with your permission. Let people understand that he was a victim too, in a different way." "The board will never approve this," Gerald said. "It makes the Foundation look—" "The board answers to me," Lucinda interrupted. "And I've already informed them this is happening." Some pushed back, worried about optics. "But this isn't about protecting the Foundation's image, Gerald. It's about doing what's right." Gerald stood, moving to the window. Outside, he could see patients in the courtyard, including Natalie laughing with Isabel. His daughter had bloomed here, had found not just healing but hope. And it was all because Lucinda had stopped on a rainy evening and chosen to help. "You don't owe me this," he said finally. "I owe you everything," Lucinda replied. "But more than that, I want to do it. Not because of guilt or obligation, but because you deserve to be recognized for who you are. A hero who's been carrying injustice for 3 decades. Let me help you put it down." Gerald turned to face her, and she saw tears in his eyes. "All right," he said quietly. "If you think it's the right thing to do." Lucinda crossed the room and took his hands. "I love you. And part of loving someone is fighting for them when they're too tired to fight for themselves." The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Patricia worked overtime arranging details, coordinating with local media who'd caught wind that something significant was happening. The gala guest list expanded as word spread. Former miners, safety advocates, even some of the federal investigators who'd worked on the case years ago. Dr. Pritchard approached Lucinda one afternoon with a suggestion. You should invite the other rescue team members, the ones who are still alive. They deserve recognition too. Lucinda agreed immediately, and Patricia tracked them down. 3 of the 5 original team members were still living, and all 3 accepted the invitation with enthusiasm. One of them, a man named Vincent Carver, called Gerald directly. I never forgot what they did to you, Vincent said, his voice gruff with emotion. We all knew the truth, but the company had us by the throat. We couldn't speak up without losing everything too. I've carried that guilt for 30 years. You did what you had to do, Gerald said. I understood. I never blamed any of you. Well, I'm looking forward to standing beside you again, Vincent replied. This time, telling the truth. Gerald tried to focus on his work, but anxiety gnawed at him. Being publicly acknowledged felt exposing in ways he hadn't anticipated. He'd spent so long being invisible, being just another working man struggling to get by, that the thought of standing in a spotlight made his skin crawl. Natalie, by contrast, was thrilled. Dad, this is amazing. Finally, people will know the truth about what you did, what you've always been. I didn't do anything special, Gerald protested. I just did what anyone would do. That's exactly why you deserve this, Natalie said. Because you don't see yourself as a hero. But you are. You've always been. Bernard, the gruff facilities manager, surprised Gerald one afternoon by pulling him aside. Heard about the gala, he said. About what Mrs. Blake's doing for you. Just wanted to say, it's about damn time. Been working with you for months now, and I can tell a man's character by how he treats his tools and his work. You're solid, Ross. Always have been. The unexpected validation made Gerald's throat tight. Thank you, Bernard. That means a lot. Also means you're stuck with us now, Bernard added with a rare smile. Mrs. Blake's making your position permanent, and I'm not breaking in another maintenance director. So don't get any ideas about leaving. As the gala approached, Lucinda found herself equally nervous. She'd given hundreds of speeches over the years, addressed crowds of thousands, but this felt different. This was personal in ways that made her vulnerable. She was putting her family's failures on public display, acknowledging the role her brother had played in destroying an innocent man's life. Patricia found her rehearsing in her office the night before the event. You're going to do great, she said. What if this makes things worse? Lucinda asked, what if people think I'm just trying to buy forgiveness, to make myself feel better? Then they're not paying attention, Patricia replied firmly. You're not doing this for yourself, Lucinda. You're doing it for Gerald, for the truth, and for every other person who's been scapegoated by powerful institutions. That matters. The night before the gala, Gerald couldn't sleep. He stood in the Foundation's garden, the same place where so much had happened between him and Lucinda, and tried to prepare himself for what tomorrow would bring. He thought about Sarah, wondered what she would think of all this. She'd always believed in him, even when he'd stopped believing in himself. He hoped she'd be proud, couldn't sleep either. Lucinda's voice came from behind him. He turned to find her wrapped in a shawl, her hair loose around her shoulders. Nervous, he admitted. Me too. She moved to stand beside him. What if this makes things worse? What if we're opening wounds that should stay closed? We're not opening wounds, Gerald said gently. We're finally cleaning them out so they can heal properly. That's different. Lucinda leaned against him, and he wrapped his arms around her. They stood like that for a long moment, drawing strength from each other, preparing for the moment when the past and present would finally, publicly collide. Thank you, Gerald said quietly, for seeing me, for fighting for me, for loving me enough to do this. Always, Lucinda whispered. No matter what tomorrow brings. Above them the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human drama. But here in the garden, two people who'd found each other across years and pain and impossible circumstances held each other close, ready to face whatever came next. Tomorrow would bring revelation and vindication, tears and applause, the closing of old wounds and the opening of new possibilities. Tomorrow would bring the end of 30 years of silence and the beginning of a truth that had waited too long to be told. But tonight, they simply held each other in the garden, grateful for this moment of peace before the storm. And when they finally walked back to their rooms, hands linked, they both slept better than they had in weeks. Together, they were ready. The Blake Foundation's grand ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and the elegant rustle of formal wear. Gerald stood near the entrance in a borrowed suit that Patricia had insisted fit him perfectly, watching donors and medical professionals mingle with champagne glasses and practiced smiles. He'd never felt more out of place in his life. Natalie sat beside him in her wheelchair. She wasn't. Quite ready for her walker at a crowded event, looking radiant in a deep blue dress that Lucinda had helped her choose. Isabel was with her, the two young women talking quietly, their friendship evident in every gesture. "You're going to be fine, Dad," Natalie whispered, squeezing his hand. "I'm terrified," he admitted. "Good, that means it matters." She smiled. "Mom would be so proud of you right now." Gerald's throat tightened. He wished Sarah could be here to see this, to see Natalie healing, to understand that the struggles they'd endured hadn't been meaningless, that something good had come from all of it. Vincent Carver appeared through the crowd, his weathered face breaking into a grin. At 68, he still carried himself like the miner he'd once been, solid, dependable, unshakable. "Ross, been too long, brother." They embraced and Gerald felt 30 years fall away. "You didn't have to come all this way." "Are you kidding?" "Wouldn't miss this for the world." Vincent nodded toward two other men making their way over, the other surviving members of the rescue team. "We've been waiting 3 decades to set the record straight. About time someone gave us the chance." The reunion was bittersweet, filled with memories of the men they'd been and the ones they'd lost. 2 of their team had died in the intervening years, one to black lung disease, the other to a heart attack at 52. The mines had taken them in the end, even if more slowly than that collapsed shaft might have. Patricia appeared at Gerald's elbow. "5 minutes, Mr. Ross. Mrs. Blake is ready when you are." Gerald nodded, unable to speak. Natalie squeezed his hand once more, and then Patricia was guiding him and the other rescue team members toward the stage where a podium stood. A cloth-covered object beside it that Gerald knew was the commemorative plaque. Lucinda stood off to the side, elegant in a silver gown that made her look both powerful and vulnerable. When their eyes met across the room, she smiled, a real smile, warm and encouraging, and some of Gerald's anxiety eased. The Foundation's board president opened the evening with the usual speeches about achievements and milestones, about the hundreds of patients who'd found hope within these walls. Gerald barely heard it, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. Vincent stood beside him, solid and reassuring, occasionally muttering comments about the fancy crowd that made Gerald want to laugh despite his nerves. Then Lucinda stepped to the podium, and the room fell silent. The transformation was immediate. This was Lucinda Blake, the philanthropist, the businesswoman, the force of nature who'd built an empire of healing from the ashes of her grief. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice steady and clear. 20 years ago, I founded this institution in memory of my brother, Dr. Peter Blake. Most of you know that story, how Peter died in a car accident that I survived. How I built this place as a way to honor his legacy and his passion for helping others." She paused, her hands gripping the podium, and Gerald saw the moment she shed her public persona and became simply herself, vulnerable, honest, real. But there's a part of that story I've never told, a part that goes back to 1987, to a mining accident that should have killed my brother but didn't. Gerald saw people lean forward, attention caught by the shift in Lucinda's tone. The room had gone absolutely still, every eye on her. On August 14th, 1987, a shaft collapsed at the Riverside mine, Lucinda continued. 5 men were trapped underground for 16 hours. The company said it was too dangerous to attempt a rescue, that we should wait for specialized equipment that might not arrive in time. The men trapped below were running out of air, running out of time, running out of hope. She gestured, and Patricia activated a screen behind her. A grainy newspaper photo appeared. Young men in mining gear, their faces streaked with dust and exhaustion, arms around each other's shoulders. Gerald recognized himself immediately, barely 22, standing beside the men who'd become his brothers that day. Vincent was there too, grinning despite the exhaustion. And the others who'd risked everything. But a group of miners, men who worked that same dangerous job every day. They didn't wait, Lucinda said. They didn't calculate odds or consider liability. They went down into that collapsed shaft, knowing they might not come back up. Because 5 human beings needed help, and that was all that mattered. The photograph remained on the screen. A moment frozen in time. Young men who'd believed that courage meant acting even when you were terrified. That heroism looked like ordinary people doing what needed to be done. All 5 trapped miners survived, Lucinda said, her voice strengthening. One of them was my brother Peter. He was 24 years old, working summer jobs to pay for medical school, and he nearly died in that shaft. But he didn't, because these men, she gestured to the photo, refused to leave anyone behind. Gerald felt Vincent's hand on his shoulder, grounding him as the memories flooded back. The darkness, the dust, the sound of men crying out in the black, the weight of earth pressing down and the desperate, exhausting work of pulling bodies free one by one. The man who pulled my brother from the rubble was named Gerald Ross, Lucinda said, and now she was looking directly at him. He was the team leader. He was the one who insisted they go down when everyone else said it was suicide. He organized the rescue, coordinated the efforts, and personally extracted 3 of the 5 trapped miners, including Peter. He saved 5 lives that day. The room erupted in applause, but Lucinda raised her hand for silence. But the story doesn't end there, she said, her voice growing harder. Because what happened next is a story about injustice, about corporate greed and the lengths powerful institutions will go to protect themselves. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Gerald saw board members shifting uncomfortably, donors exchanging glances. This wasn't the comfortable celebration they'd expected. The Riverside Mining Company had been violating safety regulations for months, Lucinda said flatly. They'd cut corners on equipment maintenance, ignored federal safety standards, and pushed workers to exceed safe production quotas. When the shaft collapsed, they needed someone to blame. They needed to deflect attention from their own negligence. She paused, letting that sink in. So they pressured my brother, a terrified 24-year-old who just survived a near-death experience, into testifying that Gerald Ross was responsible for the collapse. That his failure to follow safety protocols caused the accident. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Gerald felt his face flush, but he forced himself to remain still. Vincent's grip on his shoulder tightened in solidarity. It was a lie, Lucinda said, her voice ringing with conviction. A lie coerced through threats and intimidation. The company told Peter that if he didn't give them a name, they'd charge him with criminal negligence. They'd tie him up in lawsuits that would bankrupt his family and destroy his medical career before it began. They gave him a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Sacrifice Gerald Ross or sacrifice himself. The room was absolutely silent now. Gerald could hear his own heartbeat, feel the weight of hundreds of eyes turning toward him. Federal investigations later proved the company had been systematically violating safety regulations, Lucinda continued. But by then the damage was done. Gerald Ross was fired, blacklisted from the mining industry, his reputation destroyed. The man who'd risked everything to save others, including strangers he'd never met, was punished for that. Heroism. She pulled out a piece of paper, Peter's letter, and Gerald recognized it even from a distance. His heart clenched as she unfolded it carefully, reverently. My brother knew what he'd done, Lucinda said, her voice breaking slightly. He carried that guilt for 5 years. This is a letter he wrote in 1992, trying to find Gerald to apologize, to make amends. She began to read, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Gerald listened to his own story, told through Peter Blake's words of regret and admiration, guilt and desperate desire for forgiveness. Around him, he heard people crying, felt the weight of collective emotion, as the truth finally, after 3 decades, came to light. When Lucinda finished reading, she looked up at the crowd, then directly at Gerald. He never got the chance to deliver this letter. He died carrying it in his wallet, his apology undelivered, his debt unpaid. Her voice strengthened. Tonight I'm delivering it for him. Tonight I'm telling this man, she gestured to Gerald, and all of you, the truth that should have been told 30 years ago. Gerald Ross is a hero. He always has been. The spotlight swung to Gerald, and he stood slowly, his legs shaking. The applause started small, then grew, thunderous, overwhelming, filled with genuine respect and recognition. Vincent and the other rescue team members stood with him, and together, the 4 survivors of that long-ago rescue walked toward the stage, toward Lucinda, toward vindication, toward the moment that would finally set them all free. Gerald reached the stage on trembling legs, the applause washing over him like a wave. Lucinda met him there, taking his hand, and he drew strength from her touch. She handed him a microphone, and he stared at it for a moment, unsure what to say to a room full of strangers who now knew his story. "I don't think of myself as a hero," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I was just a young man doing what needed to be done. Those miners trapped underground, they were my friends, my colleagues. Peter Blake was a stranger, but he was someone's son, someone's brother. You don't leave people behind. That's not heroism. That's just being human." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "When Peter testified against me, I was angry. I won't pretend I wasn't. I lost my career, my reputation, my ability to provide for my family the way I'd planned. But over the years, I came to understand that Peter was a victim too. The mining company, they created a situation where a scared young man felt he had no choice but to sacrifice someone else to save himself. That's not Peter's failure. That's the failure of a system that valued profit over people." Gerald looked out at the crowd, saw faces watching him with respect and compassion. "I forgave Peter Blake years ago. And tonight, hearing that he carried guilt for what he did, that he tried to make amends, it doesn't change the past, but it gives it meaning. We were both broken by what happened in that mine. But maybe, just maybe, some good can come from it now." Lucinda stepped forward then, and Patricia appeared with the covered plaque. Together, they unveiled it, a beautiful bronze piece with the names of all 5 rescue team members. Gerald's name at the top with the inscription, "Heroes who descended into darkness to bring others into light." The applause was thunderous. Gerald felt tears streaming down his face. 30 years of pain and injustice finally acknowledged. Lucinda pulled him into an embrace, and he held her tight, both of them crying openly. When they finally separated, Lucinda returned to the microphone. "There's one more thing," she said. "Gerald Ross has been working at this foundation for the past 2 months, and in that time he's proven himself to be an invaluable member of our team. I'm offering him a permanent position, Director of Safety and Facilities, with full benefits and a salary commensurate with his skills and experience." Gerald's eyes widened. They discussed continuing his work here, but never with this kind of formal recognition. "Beyond that," Lucinda continued, her voice strong, "I'm establishing the Peter Blake Memorial Scholarship Fund. It will cover full treatment costs for patients whose families have been affected by workplace injustice or corporate negligence. Gerald's daughter Natalie will be our first recipient, with all remaining treatment costs covered by the foundation." The applause returned, but Gerald barely heard it. He was staring at Lucinda, overwhelmed by what she was offering, not just to him, but to others who'd suffered similar injustices. "This isn't charity," Lucinda said, looking directly at him. "This is justice. Long overdue, but justice nonetheless." The evening continued with more speeches and presentations, but Gerald moved through it in a daze. People approached him throughout the night. Former safety advocates who'd worked on mining regulations. Journalists who wanted to write his story. Even a few former miners who'd known him back then and had never believed the company's version of events. Near the end of the evening, a man in his 60s approached Gerald, his eyes wet. You probably don't remember me, he said. But I was one of the 5. You pulled me out second right after Peter Blake. I've thought about you every day for 30 years, wondered what happened to you. I'm so sorry for what they did. Gerald embraced the man, both of them crying. You made it out. That's all that mattered. No, the man said firmly. What matters is that people finally know the truth. As the gala wound down, Gerald found Natalie waiting for him near the entrance. A beautiful new wheelchair sat beside her, top of the line, custom fitted, donated anonymously by someone who'd been moved by the story. Look at this, Dad, Natalie said, her eyes bright. Someone left it with a note saying every hero's daughter deserves the best. Gerald knelt beside her, taking her hands. Are you okay with all this? With everyone knowing our story? I'm proud, Natalie said simply. Proud of you, proud of what Lucinda did, proud that good things can come from terrible situations, she smiled. And Dad? For the first time in 5 years, I actually believe I'm going to walk again. Really walk. Gerald pulled her into a hug, his heart so full it ached. Around them, the foundation staff began cleaning up, the gala ending but something new beginning. Lucinda appeared beside them, still in her silver gown, looking exhausted and radiant. Ready to go home? She asked, and Gerald realized she meant all 3 of them. Together, yes, he said. Let's go home. The 3 of them left together, a new family formed from old wounds, ready to face whatever tomorrow brought. And for the first time in 30 years, Gerald Ross walked out of a building with his head held high, his reputation restored, and his heart finally fully alive. 6 months later, Gerald stood at Peter Blake's grave for the first time. Lucinda was beside him, her hand warm in his, and they'd brought flowers, simple daisies that Peter had apparently loved as a child. Thank you, Gerald said quietly to the headstone, for trying to make it right, for carrying that guilt when you didn't have to, for saving your sister so she could save my daughter. Lucinda squeezed his hand, tears on her cheeks. He would have liked you, she said. Would have been grateful that you forgave him. I think he knew, Gerald replied. Somehow I think he knew. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before walking back to the car where Natalie waited. She was standing, actually standing, leaning lightly on her walker but bearing her own weight. The progress over the past months had been remarkable. Dr. Pritchard said that within another year she might not need any assistance at all. Ready? Natalie asked, and Gerald marveled at the strength in her voice, the confidence that had grown alongside her physical healing. Ready, he confirmed. They drove back to what Gerald still thought of as the foundation, though it felt more like home now. His apartment there had become permanent, comfortable, filled with photographs and the accumulated warmth of daily living. Lucinda spent most nights there now, the 3 of them becoming a family in the natural, unforced way that felt like destiny. The foundation itself had expanded, energized by the story that had emerged from the gala. The Peter Blake Memorial Scholarship Fund had received donations from across the country, enough to help dozens of families. Gerald's new position kept him busy but fulfilled, using his experience to ensure that every piece of equipment, every safety protocol, was maintained to the highest standards, but it was the small moments that meant the most. Breakfast with Natalie and Lucinda, the 3 of them talking about their days. Evening walks through the garden where everything had begun. Watching Natalie laugh with Isabel, the 2 young women planning the hiking trip they'd promised themselves. On a Thursday evening, Gerald found Lucinda in her office, working late as usual. He knocked softly, and she looked up with a smile that still made his heart skip. Come distract me, she said. I've been staring at budget projections for too long. Gerald sat across from her, studying the woman he'd somehow been lucky enough to love. I was thinking, he said carefully, about the future. Oh? Lucinda set down her pen, giving him her full attention. Natalie's going to be okay. Really okay. She's talking about starting online classes in the fall, maybe moving into her own place eventually. He paused. Which means I'll need to figure out what comes next for me. You have a job here, Lucinda said quickly. A home, if you want it. I know. Gerald stood, moving around the desk to take her hands. "But I want more than that. I want this to be our home, officially, permanently." Lucinda's eyes widened as Gerald pulled a small box from his pocket. It wasn't expensive. He'd bought it with his own money. Determined not to let her pay for everything, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. "Lucinda Blake," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "You stopped on a rainy evening when you didn't have to. You saw me, really saw me, when I'd convinced myself I was invisible. You gave my daughter her life back and gave me a reason to believe in second chances." He opened the box, revealing a modest diamond ring. "Will you marry me?" Lucinda's tears were immediate and joyful. "Yes," she said, laughing through her crying. "Yes, absolutely yes." He slipped the ring on her finger and they kissed, deep and sweet and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were grinning like teenagers. "Natalie's going to be insufferable," Gerald said. "She's been hinting about this for weeks. She helped me pick the ring," Lucinda admitted. "I wanted her blessing first." Gerald pulled her close again, overwhelmed by gratitude for this impossible, wonderful life. "I love you," he said simply. "I love you too," Lucinda replied. "Thank you for stopping that night, for accepting help, for letting me back into the world." They stood together in her office, their office really, since Gerald spent almost as much time there as she did now, and looked out at the foundation grounds. Patients moved through the garden, families gathered in the courtyard, lives being rebuilt one day at a time. "This is what Peter wanted," Lucinda said softly. "For his second chance to mean something, to create more second chances for others." "Then we'll keep building it," Gerald said. Together, and they did. In the years that followed, they married in a simple ceremony in the foundation garden, with Natalie as maid of honor despite her protests that the wheelchair would clash with her dress. The foundation expanded to 3 new cities, each one bearing Peter Blake's name and Gerald Ross's commitment to justice and healing. Natalie did walk again, graduated college, became an advocate for disability rights, met someone who loved her exactly as she was. She walked down the aisle at her own wedding without assistance, her father crying openly beside her. But the moment Gerald treasured most was simpler than any of that. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening, years after that rainy night at the rest stop. He and Lucinda sat on their porch watching the sunset, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. They didn't need to speak. After everything they'd been through, silence between them was comfortable, rich with shared history and love. "Happy?" Lucinda asked quietly. "Beyond measure," Gerald replied, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "Sometimes," he reflected, "the people we're meant to find have been in our story all along, waiting for the right moment to step into the light. Sometimes love looks like carrying burdens alone, until you meet someone willing to help you set them down. And sometimes, just sometimes, the past's deepest wounds become the foundation for the future's greatest joys." In the distance, they could hear Natalie's laughter drifting through an open window. The foundation's lights glowed warm against the gathering dusk, and Gerald Ross, who'd spent 30 years believing he was broken beyond repair, finally understood that he'd never been broken at all. He'd just been waiting for the right people to show him the way home.